I've spent all of my life in youth ministry, which meant that I didn't have to wear a suit very often. I bought one, so I thought I'd better at least put the coat on for a few minutes. I hope I can get to the end of the sermon with my tie still in place. If I don't, please forgive me. Kenneth Bailey was a theology lecturer. In fact, he was a professor. And he had spent most of his life digging into the New Testament in order to find the crux of what Jesus had to say. He became more and more interested in the stories of Jesus, and as he began to do research, he discovered that many of Jesus' stories had their genesis outside of Jesus himself. Jesus took a story, reshaped it, and then passed it on. One of the stories that he worked on was the one that we've just heard read, the story of the prodigal son. And as he looked at this, he thought, this is a very powerful story. I wonder where Jesus got it from. And he decided to take a sabbatical, and he went to the Middle East, and what was supposed to be just 2 months turned into 15 years. And he found himself going from village to village across that part of the world, telling this story of Jesus, asking the question, have you heard it before? His journeys took him from Morocco to Iran, from Syria to Sudan. And every time he stopped, he would start to talk to people and he'd retell Jesus' story. And each time he did, he would say to them, have you heard this story before? And each time, for 15 years, really nobody came back to him. It was towards the end of his journey that one woman came forward. And she said, I've heard the story before, but you told it wrong. Because that story is my story. Now, he was courteous enough not to say, this story is 2,000 years old. He actually let the woman spell it out. And the lady said to him, the husband is my husband. The son is my son. And my son came to his father, my husband, and said, I want my inheritance. And my husband rose up and killed our son because the shame was so great. He kept telling the story. Obviously, that wasn't the one. And another lady, only 2 in 15 years, came to talk to him. And the second woman said to him, the husband, the father, is my husband and my son's father. And the son is my son. And my son came to his father and he said, Father, I want my inheritance now. And the father looked at him and realized how enormous the shame would be. Because what in fact the son was saying was, I wish you were dead. I want the money now. He went to the bank, he withdrew his livelihood, and he gave it to his son, and within a week, the old man had died. He died of a broken heart. And so Kenneth Bailey looked at that and he said, what happened? How did this story of Jesus come into being? He began to do some research. He struggled to find out where these stories of Jesus came from, and particularly this one. I want you to go back to some of the research he did. It's found in Deuteronomy chapter 21. Deuteronomy chapter 21 and verse 18. This is the economy, this is the culture that Jesus' story comes from. If someone has a stubborn and rebellious son who does not obey his father and mother and will not listen to them when they discipline him, his father and mother shall take hold of him and bring him to the elders at the gate of his town. They shall say to the elders, this son of ours is stubborn and rebellious. He will not obey us. He is a profligate and a drunkard. Then all the men of his town shall stone him to death. You must purge the evil from among you. All Israel will hear and be afraid. There was a thing that grew out of this, a custom that grew out of this. It's called kazazah. If a Jewish young man took the family's money and wasted it, particularly with non-Jewish people, then that young man would be shunned. Stoned at worst, shunned perpetually. That's better than being stoned. So when this father gives his son the money and the son goes away and wastes it, as he comes home, what does the father do? He's waiting, he's watching, and as the boy comes over the horizon, this father runs to meet him. This father runs to meet him. And I want to give you some insight. Men, Middle Eastern men, do not run. It's shameful to run, particularly in a long gown. To lift up your skirts and run was incredible shame. And that's what this father did. There was a story a few years ago of an earthquake that hit Turkey, and there were 5 old men that were removed from the rubble. And people who had watched this knew what had happened. As the earth began to move, these men could have run. But rather than face the shame, they walked with dignity and lost their lives. But this father lifts up his skirts and he runs. He runs to meet his son. And I want to come back to this in a few minutes. But first I want to tell you my story. At the age of 17, I had had enough. I grew up in a Seventh-day Adventist home. I have parents who are incredibly godly. I recently lost my mum. But my dad is a prayer warrior. My father was the elder of our church, and I finally came to the place where I said to myself, I can't take this anymore. I don't want to do this. This isn't who I am. I want something different out of my life. And so I took off with a few dollars and a thumb. And I decided I would just keep going. I said to my parents, I am leaving and I am never coming back. I also said to my girlfriend at the time, I'm leaving, you'll never see me again. And I took off. I didn't know where I was going. I just put my thumb out. And with 2 friends, we began to go. And my journey took us over the Blue Mountains in Australia, out of Sydney, west across the plains, right through, and we finally finished that part of the journey in a town called Adelaide. We'd never been there before, but I want to tell you I was free, and I was going to use my freedom. I had left it all behind. But when you start eating out of garbage cans, when you've run out of money and you're sleeping rough, you start to become a little tired of that fairly quickly. We had just about come to the place where we said, let's go home. 17 years old, let's go home. I knew what I would face when I got home, the shame of having to go back. So I was loath to do it. But my 2 friends, one of them said, I know a pastor in this town. And I said, what is the matter with you? You know a pastor? Haven't we left all that rubbish behind? I gave him a really hard time, but my stomach was grumbling. My body was sore. I was filthy. I thought, well, one night may not hurt. So I begrudgingly went with him, and the 3 of us turned up on the pastor's doorstep. We knocked on the door. He wasn't home, so we broke in. I want to say, when we get to heaven, there's one man that I'm going to be searching for, and it's that pastor. 3 young, filthy boys turn up at his doorstep. They break into his house, and not one neighbour rang the police. Something about that pastor must have meant that his neighbours were not suspicious when 3 ragged kids walked in. We went out every night. We came back home late. Day drifted into the next day. What we did do was we finished all the food in his fridge. We emptied his cupboards. You know the expression, we ate him out of house and home? We literally did. There was nothing left. I don't know what he thought when he got home. The one thing we couldn't do was actually use his bed. You know, it's one thing to break in and to eat somebody's food, but to sleep in their bed, you have to have an invitation to do that. So we were sleeping on the floor, and after about the 3rd night, I was sick of it. And as I looked out into the garden, the back garden, there was a mattress, and I thought, perfect. No floor for me tonight. So I just grabbed the mattress and I dragged it down the hallway, dropped it, stepped back over the top of it and walked away. We came home probably 2 o'clock in the morning. I threw myself down on the mattress, absolutely dog-tired, but man, this was heaven. My 2 friends were on the floor. I was on a mattress. Fabulous. Except for the fact that the mattress was full of fleas. And you know those wretched little creatures, they get into every crack and crevice of your body. They find their way into your ear. They get in everywhere. And I woke up tearing the skin off my own body, scratching like not knowing what was going on. And I rushed from there into the bathroom. I tore my clothes off. I jumped into the shower. Showering doesn't help. They stayed. Those were really unwanted guests. And eventually, scratching them out of my hair, we got to the place where I thought that I was free of them. I put my clothes on. Big mistake. Still in them. You've got to shake those out. Process all over again. Anyway, finally, I woke the other guys up and I said, we've got to get out of here. We're going. You can stay if you like, but I'm going home. I've had it. The other 2 guys decided to come, and as they walked, they realised that fleas were crawling on their legs. It was a disaster. You imagine that pastor coming home, finding his cupboards bare, nothing in the fridge, no food left. And as he walks in, the whole of the hallway moves. There's a plague of fleas. I never actually found him. I think that he has passed away now. I'm looking forward to meeting. On the way home, we just hitched and hitched and hitched, and I became more and more desperate to get home. I knew what the journey that this young man took, and we just kept going. It took us 3 days. We'd gone straight across the centre of New South Wales through the desert. Now I took the other route home, up the coast, along the Great Ocean Road and up the east coast. 3 days. Hardly any sleep. But you know, when you're 17, you are totally invincible. And I got home, the first thing I did was ask my father for the keys to his car and money from his wallet. And my father gave me both. I got on the phone and I called the girl that I told I was never coming back. And as she heard my voice, she said, I thought you were never coming back. I said, I'm here. Do you want to go out or not? Well, every woman in here, your heart leaps, doesn't it? You say to yourself, if only I had invitations like that. The girl said yes. I picked her up. We went down to the beach. We spent a long time at the beach. And then we got up in the darkness and decided to go home. On the way home, I said to her, you know, you're going to have to talk to me because I am really exhausted. It took me 3 days to get home to see you. And I'm just about dead with tiredness. We started driving, and in the middle of all of this, I looked down at the fuel gauge and noticed that it was somewhere between fumes and empty. And I realised, I don't know how that could ever have happened, because my father religiously filled up the car every night, but not that night. And I pulled into a service station, jumped out, started to fill it up, finished off, topped it off, and then I went for my wallet. And I tried everywhere and I couldn't find it. I knew that I had money because my father had given it to me. It was in my wallet. And I went inside and I said to this guy, I've lost my wallet. And he said to me, son, you stand over there, I'm calling the police. I have kids like you come in here every night of the week trying this stunt. And I thought, I'm bigger than him. I'm going to knock his lights out. And I stepped to the counter and I was about to do that very thing. And sanity prevailed. And I said to him, why don't you ring my dad? And he said, okay, well, what's the number? I got hold of my father on the phone, handed it to him. My dad must have said something good, assured him that he was going to pay for the fuel or something, because the fellow nodded and said yes. And just before he put the phone down, I grabbed it and I said to my father, Dad, I want you to go to bed and I want you to go to sleep. I knew that if I wasn't home, my dad would spend the rest of the night in prayer. Very considerate boy. My father took my advice and he did go to bed and he did go to sleep. But something else happened. As I went to put the phone down, the fellow took it, put it down himself, and he said, your father seems like a really nice guy. Where did he get you? That was it. That was enough. I was going to leap across the counter. And again, something stopped me. We got into the car, we started to drive, and I thought, no, I'm going back to the beach. And I prayed. I said, God, I want the wallet, all right? Does God hear prayer like that? Well, does he? He hears every prayer. We went back to the beach. I walked down across the sand. I saw the spot where we had spent most of our time. I got down on my hands and knees and I put my hand through the sand, and there it was. And I thought, wow, what luck! That is amazing. Put it in my pocket, walked back. There was no thank you, Lord. There was none of that. It was just good luck. As we're starting to drive, I kept saying and I'll call her Heather because I have to call her something. And I said to Heather, you're going to have to keep me awake. While we drive, you talk. I don't care what you talk about, just talk loud. And she said, I'm tired. And I said, look, you can't be as tired as me. So we had a gentle argument. And she lay down across the front bench seat of the ute and went to sleep. I was, a lot of power to get her to go out, but nothing to keep her to talking. And as we drove along, I began to realise that she was not going to wake up. So I turned the radio up as loud as it would go. It was distorting. And I remember the song. She loves you. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Do you know that classic? That wonderful Beatles piece? So I was singing it. She loves you, yeah, yeah, yeah. Sleep. I could not get her to wake up. And so I put my head out the window to get the cold air to keep me awake, and then kept singing, watching the Speedo, out the window, watching the Speedo, singing as loud as I could. And when you're tired, you get mesmerised by the Speedo. And I began to realise that I hadn't seen the road for quite a while. I was just watching the Speedo. And you try again, so I sang louder and I put my head out the window, and then there was this bang! I woke up to find that the car had married itself to a telegraph pole. And the headlights were now looking at each other. There were sparks dancing off the roof of the car. I tried to get out of... You try to get out of a wreck like that. I tried. I couldn't budge my door. I'd pulled my head back from the steering wheel only to find that my ear had been taken off. I had a handbrake through my knee. And I started screaming to tell her to get out. When you've got raw fuel and electricity, not a good combination. And eventually I couldn't get her door open, so I lay down on top of her and I kicked and kicked and kicked until her window smashed, and then I climbed out. I stood up and I fell down. I stood up and I fell down, I stood up and I fell down, I stood up and I fell down. I'm not very fast. Took me a while to realise that one of my legs kept collapsing. And eventually I managed to balance, and I reached in and I grabbed her by the legs and I pulled her out, and she fell out of the car on top of me, and I knew we had limited time. So I wrapped my arm around her and dragged her across the road. When we got to the far side, away from the wreck, lights were coming on. Houses were lighting up, and a lady came out, and I looked at her and I knew her. And I'm going to use her name. Her name was Mrs. Masters, a nurse from Sydney Adventist Hospital. And she came out and she took control. An incredible woman. She began to give orders and tell people what needed to happen. She told somebody to run and get a blanket. She came over to me, did a quick diagnosis and said, "You've severed an artery, put your thumb in the side of your head." So I did what I was told. I had my hand on my head pressing as hard as I could, and then she kept going and she said, "You've also got another one in the leg. I want you to put your thumb in there and hold that." So I'm now holding myself, but the only thing of concern to me at that stage was the fact that Heather had done nothing. She hadn't screamed. I looked at her and I thought, something is very wrong. And I'll tell you, I started praying for the second time that night. Now I was praying, "Dear God, please fix this." And my prayers just kept going. And eventually the blanket came out, and Mrs. Masters laid it over the top of Heather and pulled it up and over her face. And I knew what that meant. I knew that this selfish creep of a kid had killed the only person that he cared about. He didn't care about himself, but he did have feelings for her. My prayers at that moment just took on an urgency. And I tried to use all the formulas. Dear God, loving Heavenly Father. I tried to remember everything my dad had ever said in a prayer time. And I began pleading with God. And then the light split the night. The ambulance was on its way. I heard the siren coming. I saw that flashing red light that nearly blinds you. And they came down, and they put Heather on a stretcher, and they put her in the back of the ambulance. And at that moment I thought, please don't put me in there with her. Please don't do that to me. And they did. And I found myself sitting in the back of an ambulance, looking at the form of my girlfriend under a blanket. And at that moment I said, "Dear God, if you will fix this, I will do anything." And I couldn't think, the worst thing I could think of was to be a pastor. Seriously. I saw them as, I won't tell you what I saw them as. And my pleading was such that I finally said to God, "If you'll fix this, I'll do anything you ask. I will even be a pastor." You know how this story ends, because that's what I am. We got to the hospital, and I had a new pair of jeans on. In those days, it wasn't trendy to have the knees out of your jeans. If you had decent jeans, you had decent jeans, and I did. And I had beetle-type hair, shoulder-length beetle-type hair. And these doctors came over, they checked her out, discovered that most of the blood on her was mine, but she was unconscious. So they decided that they'd work on me, and they wanted to cut the leg off my jeans. So I was hopping on one leg, trying to fight these guys off. They wanted to start on my hair. I wasn't going to let them anywhere near that. And in the middle of that chaos, my father walked into the emergency room. And he looked at Heather and he said, "Is she going to be all right?" "Thanks, Dad. No concern for me." And they said, "We think she is, but we have to wait and see." And then he said, "And my son?" And they said, "Well, if we can get near him, we could probably tell you. Can you calm him down?" And my dad didn't try. He did something that made me incredibly angry. He said to a room full of doctors and nurses, "Do you mind if I pray?" And as my father prayed, he broke a stubborn heart. And I realised how much my dad loved me. And you would think that experience would change me, wouldn't you? I found out later that my dad did go to sleep. I knew he never did, because when I was away from home, we never locked the doors at our house. We only locked them if I was out. And I'd have to come home and climb up the drain pipe to the second floor and in through my window. And when I climbed in and fell on the bed, my dad would have a cricket bat or a tennis racket, pair of boots in my bed, and I'd pick them up and throw them down on the floor, and then I'd hear him laughing. And at that moment, he'd go to sleep because he knew I was home. That night, he had gone to bed and he'd gone to sleep. And he woke up with a jolt, and he got down on his knees and he started praying. He realised that when he tried to turn the power on, there was none. And he walked out to the kitchen to find the electric clock had stopped at the very time he'd fallen out of bed. He prayed for me, he woke my mother, and he said, "Gwen, we've got to go. Our son's out there in the night." And he drove across Galston Gorge and saw his car married to the pole and just kept driving and got to the hospital shortly after I did. A few weeks later, I was out of hospital. Today I would have looked really trendy. I had half a shaved head, a massive stitches. But at that moment, my dad, I was under my car, an old FJ, and I was under there doing some work, and it was Sabbath morning. And my dad came out and he looked down through the engine bay straight into my face. And he said to me, "Baz, you're coming to church today, son." And I spat at him. I told him what he could do with his church and with his God, and the fact that I wanted nothing to do with that stuff. And my dad's eyes welled up with tears, and he stepped back and he went to church. I have to tell you that my dad put up with a lot. He had me, and I don't want to tell you about my sisters. That's their story. I decided that this was the day that I would go to church, and it would be the last time I would ever have to go. I would make it impossible for the church to accept me. I didn't bother getting changed. I just pulled on my leather jacket. I had grease all over my hands. I was filthy, and I kicked my bike into life, and I took it to church. And I popped monos, wheel stands on the back of wheel, and I went up and down the church car park. I thought, I probably won't have to go into church. The deacons will come and tell me to get lost. Well, they didn't. So I dropped the bike down on its side, and I threw donuts, spitting rocks all over the saints' cars. That's a no-no. They didn't come. Finally had to go into church, and I sat in the back row, only seat left, and I looked up to the front. My dad was on the platform, head elder, and I saw him from the very back of the church. It was like he was swallowing loaves of bread. He was He was really struggling. And I saw his eyes well up, and then they just fell down his cheeks. And my dad was in tears, and I thought, what is the matter with you? I was ready to stand up and curse him. Eventually, I sat through a very long, tedious sermon. And at the end of it, people got up and they were moving out, and I didn't get a chance to escape. And people were walking down the aisle, and they were patting me on the shoulder and saying, "Great to see you, Barry. Fantastic you're here." And I'm saying to myself, what is the matter with you people? Are you blind? Can't you see? And it kept going, and eventually I thought, I've got to get out. And I jumped into the line, and I went out, there's my dad. And I threw out my filthy hand. And I put it into his, and I let him feel the grease. He didn't notice. He couldn't speak. He was just thrilled that I was there. And then I took the pastor's hand and I ground it in. And I knew when I let go that he was going to do this. Take out, we've all got them. I'd like to see the pastors here. Can you put up your white hankies? I thought he'd pull the white hanky out, but he couldn't get a filthy hand into his pocket to get at it. And he was about to say something, and I thought, come on. He didn't. Thank God he didn't. I walked down the steps, and then the deacons came. And the first one was coming for me, and I thought, that, this man had two perfect children. One had gone to college to study to be a pastor, and the other one had married a church worker. Two perfect kids. My dad had me. I'm not going to talk about them. And as I was standing there watching him come, I knew what he was going to do, and I had a heart full of bile and a mouthful of venom, and I was going to spew it all over him. And as I stood there waiting for him to come, my hands balled into fists, and I leant back and I was going to king hit him. Knock him out on the steps of the church, and then run like mad and hope the motorbike started before the rest of the deacons came. But as he came towards me, it wasn't a fist, it was an open hand. And he threw out his hand. And when people do that, you've got no choice but to take it. And I took his hand and he pumped my arm and he said, "Wow, great to see you at church today, Barry." And when people do that, what can you say? I couldn't think of a reply. Everything that I wanted to come out was now inappropriate. And the next little guy that came up to me, I know that very few of you will know him, but I want to pay tribute to this man. His name was Bill Winterton, a little Englishman. Tiny little guy who eventually built a model of the sanctuary and travelled all over this division. But a man who knew his Bible, that's one thing. But he loved the kids in that church. And he came up to me, filthy as I was, and he was in his best suit. And he threw his arms around me. And he put his head on my shoulder and started to cry. And he said, "Barry, I've prayed so long for this day." And I wanted to unpeel him. I wanted to get him off me. But his tears had an impact. I went to church that day determined that it would be the last time I ever had to do it. And I've never stopped going. And I know, I'm 67 years old, but I know that my home church this coming Sabbath will remember me. They still pray for their kids. And now I'm a grandfather. But prayer does things. And this was a church that loved its young people back into the life of that church. I have to tell you that all of us left. We all tried it. But every one of us from my age group came back. They came back because they were loved back. I want you to go back to Luke chapter 15. The context for Jesus telling this story of the prodigal son. the context you find best if you go back to Matthew 18. And if you go to Matthew 18, you find there that Jesus says things like this: if anyone causes one of these little ones who believe in me to stumble, it would be better for him to have a large millstone hung around his neck and be drowned in the depths of the sea. That's how serious Jesus takes this. Anyone that causes a young person to stumble. And then he goes on, see that you do not despise one of these little ones, for I tell you, their angels in heaven always see the face of my Father in heaven. What Jesus is saying is, cause a kid to stumble and God knows about it. This is the only place in Scripture that you have a reference to a guardian angel. This place, Jesus says, they've got an angel looking out for them, so don't you cause them to stumble. And then he goes on to tell the story of the lost sheep. In the context of young people, he tells the story of the lost sheep. And that story in Luke goes on to becoming not a lost sheep, but a lost boy. So the son starts to come home. And as he does, it says in verse 20, so he got up and went to his father, but while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him and ran to his son and threw his arms around him and kissed him. We don't do that. I don't know, do New Zealand men kiss each other? Australians, you shake hands 3 times quickly. 1, 2, and you let go. Well, I'm tired of that. And in recent years, I have taken to kissing my father and he hates it. But I've told him I'm going to keep doing it because I love that man. This father loves the boy. And I want to tell you, he stunk. He bought his life in the pigsty with him. He stunk. And the father runs, and I always thought it was wonderful that he ran out there and accepted him. But there's something else here. If you go back to Deuteronomy, which we read earlier, Deuteronomy 21, what was the father really doing? At that time, it would be the kids who would start the process. As the boy was coming home, the young people of the village would recognise this fellow coming back. And they would pick up stones and they would already be pelting him with them. And so this father, knowing that that's going to happen, runs out to meet his son and he puts his body on the line. The dad shields the boy from what is going to happen. And people know to get to that son, they have to go through him. Thank God for that sort of grace. The father covers him. And it's not enough. Even though he stinks, what's the next lot of instructions? While he was still a long way off, father saw him and ran and was filled with compassion, ran to his son, threw his arms around him and kissed him. Then the son said, Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. What was the full speech? He actually goes on, his speech is, make me like one of your hired servants. I'm not worthy to even be a household servant. Make me like one of your hired servants. The people who come in, do the reaping, get fed, and move on. That's all he's asking for. But the father cuts him off. He isn't worthy to be called his son. But the father cuts the boy off before he can finish his speech. And then the father says to his servants, quick. I love that. Let's not hold back on this. Let's not have an inquisition. Quick. Bring the best robe and put it on him. So not only does he shield the boy with his own body, he now covers him with his best robe. And now the village knows that despite the shame the old man has suffered, he's prepared to wear it for his son. And he goes on. The robe. And then the next thing is, said to his servants, quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. I want to look at the sandals for a second. only a household servant would have sandals. A hired servant who was itinerant would not. They would come in, they'd have really rough footwear, if any. But this father wants to say something to his son. You will not be a hired servant. You are my son. And he puts sandals on his feet. Do yourself a favour sometime and go and have a look at Rembrandt's Prodigal Son. It's a magic piece of work. Every time I look at it, it just speaks to me. You've got the father cradling his son. The son's down on his knees in front of his dad. And look at his feet. One's bare and the other one, what's left of his sandals, falling to pieces. Put sandals on his feet. Put a ring on his finger. And that ring is what? That's the signed checkbook. This story, Jesus said, the father divided to them his livelihood. He gave them everything he had. Well, he obviously was a good businessman because now he's back. And as the boy comes home, he gives him the ring and he says to him, that's the key to the bank. Would you trust that boy? He still stinks of his past. Would you trust him? I'd struggle. This father gives him not just a second chance, but gives him the key to the bank. And finally he says, kill the fatted calf. Now in that culture, they only killed the fatted calf on 3 different occasions. When you seal a major business deal, in fact most people couldn't do it. You couldn't kill the fatted calf. Too much expense involved. You ate very little meat. To kill a fatted calf was to kill your future. But they did it to seal a big business deal. They did it at the time of a wedding. And this last one is really significant. They did it at the birth of a child. What is the father saying? You're fully welcomed home. You are totally accepted. You're cleansed. You've got the future of this family in your hands. You're born again. We have a church that is currently hemorrhaging, friends. We are losing over 50% of our young people. And I spoke to President and Secretary for this conference, and they talked to me about how many churches in this conference who have way, they don't have 50% gone. They have 100% gone. You've got, is it 19 churches that don't have anybody under the age of 35? We only need one hard winter and we're going to be closing churches. We've got to start to take it seriously. How do we reach out and take hold of? How do we help young people come home? How do we let them know that God loves them? How deep the Father's love is. I want to share one last story with you and then a Bible text. We haven't got time to unpack the rest of this story now. If you look at it, there are 2 lost boys, aren't there? There was one who was home and didn't know that he was lost. But he was connected but totally disconnected. And you see that as he will not even go into the celebration. A friend of mine was asked to take some meetings in Miami. And to do that, he had to travel from Berrien Springs down to Miami. It was terrible weather. He got to the airport in plenty of time. He knew which seat he wanted. He had an aisle seat, and when he got to the aisle seat, he thought, he's walking down, he said, the aisle, I can get out if needs be, I can walk if it's... And as he looked at the seat, there was a young mother with a baby on her knee and a little girl in the seat beside her. A little girl with ants in her pants. Little girl who was wriggling. She was a bag full of worms. And he just sat down beside this child and he thought, this is going to be one long trip. How do you do this? And before very long, the father's heart. He leans across to the lady and he says to her, can I read the little girl a story? And so out came the book, and he's entertaining the little girl, doing all the voices, reading to her. She's totally engrossed. And they were about 10 minutes out of Miami when the biggest storm since the flood hit. And the plane was thrown thousands of feet up and then dropped just as far. And to begin with, nobody did anything. And then the little girl screamed, like only little girls can. She filled the air with a scream of terror. And before very long, everybody was screaming. And the cabin stuff was coming out and stuff was going everywhere. It was chaos. And my friend Joe tells me that he looked around and everybody was screaming. And then he realized he was too. And he thought to himself, this may be the end of our lives. My friend Joe comes from Nineveh. Another preacher came from Nineveh. And he thought, this is the moment. And he started to preach. And he raised his voice above the screaming. And he just preached his heart out and let people know that although life might finish soon, it was not the end if you are in Christ. It's not the end if you've given your life to Jesus. And this chaos is happening. He's preaching his heart out. The cabin becomes still. They're going every which way. And he begins to hear it. Our Father, who art in heaven. And then he heard someone praying to Allah. And he began to realize that this plane was soaked in prayer. And he kept preaching. And then the storm stopped as soon as it had started, as quickly as it had started, and they found themselves on the ground. If you've travelled in the States, you know what they do. Everybody claps and cheers and whistles. The plane came down, it taxied towards the terminal, and as it did, there was just this rapturous applause. As they were getting out, Joe it wasn't quick enough. And he finally said to the young mother, I know you've got a lot of stuff. Do you want me to help? And she said, oh, thank you. So she's got the baby on her hip. Joe's got the little girl in front of him, and he's got his cases, and he's trying to steer her towards the door. Mum's pulling stuff. He's got stuff all over him, and he's trying to keep this little toddler. And as they get towards the final door to go out into the baggage claim, he looked up and he saw a young man standing there. And he watched as the young man watched the young woman. And he began to realize what was happening here. This was Dad. This was Mum. They were his kids. And he watched this thing happen, and he's still trying to steer this little girl, and the mother's beside him, and at that moment the little baby emptied its stomach of everything it had eaten since birth. Came out, he said, he tried to describe it for me. I had children, I didn't need the description. Came out, and it went straight, the little child, it went straight into the mother's face. It dripped down all over the little girl. Her hair was running with it. And he said it was a stench most foul and putrid. And so now he's trying to steer this little child, trying not to breathe. And they finally got to the door. The door opens and the father comes forward and he scoops up that little baby, that little tiny girl, and he hugs her. And then he takes the baby, and his wife describes what's happened. And he's now enveloped her as well. And this man has got everything that's dear to him. Yes, they stink, but it doesn't matter. A love that goes beyond the stench. That's what happens in the story of Jesus. You know, this story of Jesus could not have been made up by anybody but the Son of God. Because this gives us a description of the heart of God. And Joe said, he's a little dramatic. He fell down on his knees in an international terminal and he raised his hands to God and thanked the Father in heaven for a demonstration of love. I want to read a final text to you. It comes from 1 John chapter 3. See what great love the Father has lavished on us, that we should be called children of God. And that is what we are. The reason the world does not know us is that they do not know him. Dear friends, now are we children of God. And there's no better place to be. I am pleased that my earthly Father loved me enough to make all the sacrifices that he did. But it's nothing by comparison to what my heavenly Father has done. Beloved, now are we the sons and daughters of God. Fantastic gift of grace.